Welcome everybody to the latest Truth and Consequences Zoom chat, and I'm so excited today to talk to my old friend Mike Grunwald. Mike, good to have you here today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. This is a thrill.
So Mike has written a fantastic new book, which I have here, and you can see I have read it because you can see the yellow post-it pads. That's proof that I actually did read it. It's called "We're Eating the Earth: The Race to Fix Our Food System and Save our climate." Sorry, and Mike, you have spent an entire career in journalism. You've written for Boston Globe, where I used to be a columnist. You've written for Politico, the New York Times, Washington Post. You're a contributing writer at the New York Times now. But you have gone on this journey to write about the environment, to write about climate. So I guess I'm kind of curious what drove you to do this. But actually, before I even say that, let me make one confession. I need to say something really early on here. I generally avoid reading articles about the environment and books about the environment. And I'm going to be very honest here because I find them just kind of depressing. I find climate news depressing because it feels like, and this is a guy who's written, I don't know, hundreds of stories about gun violence, who writes about the Trump administration, who writes all kinds of stuff. And for some
You write
reason, the
about the
environment,
Middle East.
I read the Middle East. I read about a lots of really depressing, unsolvable issues. And for some reason, the environment is like where I draw the line because it feels so intractable and so depressing and so, inevitable. Which is what is interesting about your book, this book, While We Are Eating the Earth, um, because you balance the sort of catastrophic nature of climate change, the catastrophic issues about climate change, with an incredibly hopeful message. And this is something that is very hard to do. It's very impressive, actually. It's one thing that makes this book really compelling. And so, to my question a second ago, what inspired you to write this book? What inspired you to want to focus on food? And I'm curious, did you come away from this experience more or less hopeful about the future?
Well, it's funny. I mean, I will say that, having now buried my face in the climate for 6 years, I found it an extraordinarily welcome relief from focusing on politics. I really, and I say it as a joke, but I find it way less depressing than certainly modern American politics. I mean, look, I've written about the environment for 20 years and the climate for quite a lot of them, uh, but I'd always done energy and climate. Like most people who do climate, that's I always say food is about a third of the climate problem, but
Right,
it's less than 3% of climate finance, and it's like 0% of climate conversation. And
right.
essentially, I realized I didn't know squat about it. So that was kind of exciting for me as a reporter. This idea that here food and climate is a big deal, particularly this idea that we are eating the earth, that 2 of every 5 acres of this planet are now cropped and grazed. It's using 70% of our fresh water. It's huge leading driver of deforestation and water pollution. It's bad. It's a big deal. And I was spectacularly ignorant about it. So
Mm,
that was kind of an exciting process to be like, I'm just going to learn everything. And,
yeah.
there are 1,000 books about energy and climate, and, not so many about this. I felt like this is something that the world needs to grapple with. And, I grappled.
Yeah, it's funny. I think you actually get to something that a lot of journalists, I think, why people get into this field, it's because we're just interested in stuff. There's stuff
Yeah.
that happens
Yeah.
in the world that interests us. We want to know more about it. And this is a way for us to learn more about it. You can call people up and you can say, hey, tell me about this. It's an amazing thing.
Yeah.
And you can write about it and you can, sort of educate yourself on it. But
No, that's right. And
yeah,
no, I was just going to say, because like, I mean, the Trump stuff, I was at Politico magazine and I was finding it really depressing because I do try to write about at least slightly complicated issues and try to make them accessible to humans. That's, sort of my shtick. Um, and to me, like Trump wasn't complicated. It was just the bad man doing the bad things.
yeah.
And on every issue, I
Surrounded by
felt
bad people. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
and I'd write like 5,000 word pieces that tried to dive into issues, but they could have been a tweet. Um, while this was exciting, and honestly, like even energy and climate, which I think is kind of interesting, but we sort of know what to do about it. right? You got to like electrify the global economy and stop, use clean electricity, and over time stop using fossil fuels. And we're starting to do it. I mean, I know what's happening in Washington sucks, but globally, like we're having this clean energy revolution. And so it's a political story. It's like, how fast are we going to get there? Well, food, like, when I started this, we didn't even know what we needed to know.
Right.
So it's still an analytical story for a dork like me. It's a figuring out story, and my main character is a figurer outer.
Yeah, yeah. Talk us through a little bit about the sort of the main protagonist in the book, a guy named Searchinger. How did you get in touch with him, and why is he such an important part of the story?
Well, it's funny. I've known Tim for 25 years, and he actually makes a cameo in my first book about the Everglades. He's the guy who first gave me the tip about the Everglades that led me to move to Florida and write my first book and meet my wife and like have a family. So, a
He was
pretty
kind of
good
a Yenta
source,
in a
right?
way, you might say,
Yeah, exactly. And
indirectly.
yeah, he kind of had a bit of an effect on me. Um, but we sort of lost touch, and he had been a lawyer. He was a wetlands lawyer, who stumbled into ethanol and biofuels, and essentially realized that all of the climate analyses of biofuels, this is like farm grown fuels like corn ethanol or soy biodiesel, they were essentially doing it wrong,
Right.
because they were ignoring land use, they were ignoring the eating of the earth. And so Tim is just, I mean, aside from being a kind of fun character, he's loud and brilliant and relentless and doesn't suffer fools gladly. But he's a facts guy. He's science. He's data. He does all the reading. He's like always pissed off that everybody else doesn't. He's got on his front porch the doormat says no dogmas allowed. I mean, there's like a cute picture of a dog. That's the joke.
Right.
So like I said, this is an analytical story, and he's kind of the perfect analyst, the guy who is trying to just get to the truth, which so my book sort of follows his journey. But of course, like I said, like this was kind of a journey for me too, because I
Right.
came in with no preconceived notions or any notions at all, other than this is a really huge problem that needs to be fixed, and let's try and figure
Well,
out what would be the ways to go about it.
let me go back to my initial question, though. Did you come away from
Yeah.
this experience more or less hopeful about the future? At
I
least in the
mean,
context of climate.
yeah, I mean, look, I do think the kind of doomism is kind of dumb, right? You hear all the time, like, oh, if we don't reduce emissions 43% by 2030, that's game over for the climate. And it's like, as if like, 42% we're all, the species is going extinct, but
Right. Right.
44% everything's cool. And it's just like not how it works. There is no game over for the climate. Um, you know, there's better and worse, and better is better than worse. Which sounds kind of stupid and obvious, but I do think the kind of apocalyptic way people talk about this stuff is it's just not helpful. I mean, you know, Paradise, California, right? The one that burned down in the wildfire. It's like they already had their apocalypse. And there
Right.
are going to be more
Right.
apocalypses. Like the goal is to have fewer apocalypses,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
to make life better for more people who are living in the floodplains in Bangladesh, or smallholder farmers in Africa. So I do think of this as like it's a continuum, and I wrote about tons of really promising solutions to these food and climate problems that I'm sure that we'll get into. But the sort of too long don't read, although of course everybody should read, is that none of these solutions really have any traction yet. We're
Right.
so early. We're very this is like food is like 20 years behind energy, but like they are very promising solutions. And, and 20 years ago, we were nowhere on energy. There were really no alternatives to wind and solar. And when I started writing about it, and there had just been a documentary called Who Killed the Electric Car?
Yeah.
That was seen to be a dead technology. So when you see all these brilliant, innovative people who are trying to solve these problems, I think as a species, we kind of suck at planning for the future and making sacrifices for the planet, but we're really good at inventing stuff. And we're pretty good at solving problems that we really set our mind to, or at least like treat like World War II. Um, so, this is me kind of banging my spoon in my high chair and saying, like, hey, this is a big problem that we need to solve. And yeah, I'm more optimistic that we are going to make some progress on it, but I am really worried about the lack of progress that's being made, and particularly the amount of resources and excitement that is being plowed into solutions that I think are fake.
So I want to get into that last part, but I do have to ask, I do have to interject politics into this. Um,
Yeah.
the earlier this month, the one big beautiful bill, which I think it'd be better described as the one big steaming pile of monkey shit bill that passed the Congress. One of the
Was that
big
the
parts,
subtitle? Was it the
it should be, but it's not,
yeah.
unfortunately. It's one of the big parts about this bill was that it took out or repealed many of the green energy subsidies and investments that were a big part of the Inflation Reduction Act, signed into law by Joe Biden when he was president. So, what do you think is the impact of that? I mean, let me step back a second here. One of the things that this bill trying to do is invest more money in extractive energy sources like coal and gas and oil, and take it away from clean energy. Do you think that's going to have a significant impact on these green energy industries, or is this, or what ultimately how do you think this is going to play itself out?
Well, it ain't good.
Yeah,
That's you don't want to promote the bad stuff and take away the incentives for the good stuff. And that is what this bill does. Um, and like I said, there's been just in the United States and pretty much around the world right now, if you are building a new power plant, it is almost definitely a zero emissions power plant. And that is partly because of these incentives, and particularly the incentives have helped wind and solar
sure.
and electric vehicles get cheaper and competitive, so that now they will hopefully do better without subsidies. But the
Can I?
subsidies help, and if, yeah, no, and then obviously, and on the fossil side, there have always been subsidies, and there's the kind of incumbency advantage.
Right.
And yes, as you mentioned, this bill actually goes out of its way to promote some of those dirty industries that already don't have to pay the costs of the pollution that they inflict on the rest of us. So again, the United States is not the world, and the rest of the world is continuing to plow ahead with this stuff. Even in the United States, this isn't going to just kill clean energy in its tracks. But it's, like I said, these things are generally better and worse, and this is worse.
So I think I read that something like 90% of all new energy sources in the US are coming from renewables, from clean energy.
Electricity, yeah, power plants,
Electricity.
yeah,
I think you said
yeah.
this in the book that the electricity is the one place where you've seen the most progress as far as in the fight on climate change. Why is
That's
that?
right. I mean, solar beats coal. I mean, it's just
Yeah,
and wind is really good too. And they just there was a problem. You remember my last book was about the Obama stimulus,
yes,
which poured $90 billion into clean energy, and all anybody remembers from that is like Solyndra. There was like a
right,
solar manufacturing
right,
company that
right.
went bust, and there were a bunch of battery companies that went bust, and some clean coal plants. But ultimately, it did exactly what it was supposed to do. It jump started clean energy. That's one of the reasons Solyndra failed, was it was making expensive solar panels, and
Mm.
other solar panels got cheap. And so now we really do have this. I have solar panels on my roof, and they just
Yes,
paid off. They took 8 years to pay off, so it was like putting a 12.5% bond on my roof. And they are now economically sensible and rational, and so I think you're seeing them go mainstream. My utility, Florida Power and Light, I call them Florida Plunder and Loot. They don't give a shit about the environment, but they're building solar all over the place
Right.
because it's an awesome deal for them. It's cheap electrons. And so I think, to bring it back to food, things like, you can imagine like alternative proteins, like the fake meat, whether it's made out of plants or from animal cells or fungi, that could be the equivalent of clean energy, alternative energy, and that, if they can get cheap and good and people like it, that could have mass adoption. Obviously, that hasn't happened yet, but again, and that hasn't had the kind of government support or
Right.
private investment where, you know, there were $250 billion invested in solar in the first quarter of this year. Um,
Wow. That's
that's
amazing.
it's like this is it's taking over the world because it's like, you don't have to pay for that stuff that comes out of the sky.
Right. Right. So one of the things also about the book that I think is really interesting that uh, I think it's sort of somewhat counterintuitive to me a little bit is that you say, I think at one point in the book that this is a book about land and how we use land. And you say land is not free. Now I just want to be clear. My background photo of cows in a very large field was not, was it,
You're just trolling me.
I am trolling you. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's what
yeah.
I'm doing. I am trolling because I've heard Mike talk about this book and talk about the, the why cows are bad for the environment and why we use too much land. So talk a little bit about this because I think this is sort of interesting. Uh, how we use land and how to raise food is really kind of the crux of what this book is about in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I mean, I think we all, those of us who live, in our little, blue enclaves of, cosmopolitan elites in the cities, we take the cross country flight and you look out the window and you see all those, rectangles and circles, and you're like, damn, there's a lot of agriculture out there.
Right.
And I guess my book, you know it's an exciting narrative, and and I want everybody to read it, and it's fun and interesting. You'll learn a lot. But the basic idea is like, well, actually there's a lot of agriculture out there. it,
Yeah.
and and 2/3 of it is pasture, and 3/4 of it is pasture plus crops that we grow to feed to animals. So the Earth, we had this natural planet that's becoming an agricultural planet, and really it's becoming an animal farm. Um,
Mm.
and then of those animals, like right now, the biomass of our livestock outweighs the biomass of wild animals by like 30 to 1.
Wow.
So it's
Amazing.
crazy. So again, it's like I know they're only like big numbers and small numbers, but these are really, really big numbers. And beef is, as you mentioned, cattle are the baddies. They use 10 times as much land and generate about 10 times as many emissions as chicken or pork. And look, chicken and pork are worse than beans or lentils. But beef is just so bad. I mean, it uses half of our agricultural land in the United States to give us 3% of our calories. The average
Wow.
American eats the equivalent of 3 burgers a week. And if it was only 2 burgers, we'd save a landmass the size of Massachusetts every year. So
Wow.
I cut beef and lamb out of my diet, and again, I'm not scoldy. You know me. I'm like,
No, no, you're
I'm
the
not the
opposite
kind
of
of person
Scoldy.
who's going to be like getting up on my high horse and telling people what to do. And often I sort of sound a little bit like the cow in the Chick-fil-A ad saying, like, eat more chicken. But if you do want to do something about your diet, and we do vote on these issues 3 times a day, uh, I could give you a list of 50 things, but eat less beef is so much more important than the other ones. Than that's really is the biggie.
I want to just let you know that since I saw it, was at Mike's book party in New York a couple of weeks ago, and he made this pitch about how pork and beef is bad, and so I've really stopped eating
Pork's
as
not
much
so
pork
bad.
and beef.
It's really
No, I'm
pork's
sorry,
not so
lamb.
bad.
Sorry, lamb, lamb,
Beef and
beef and
lamb.
lamb.
Yeah,
I don't eat a lot
yeah,
of lamb
yeah,
anyway, so but I've
yeah.
cut back on my beef consumption.
Well,
Uh,
great,
since I saw this
great.
your presentation. In fact,
Yeah, it's
I actually was out to dinner recently with my girlfriend, and she was there at the event, and she said, I think one of us ordered beef, and she looked at me, and she said, did you forget what we learned at Mike's event? And I said, oh my God, you're right.
Well, it is
So I
a lot of
I,
these,
I
a
ordered the
lot of these
chicken instead.
issues,
Yeah,
a lot of this stuff. It's like, it's kind of once you hear it, you can't unhear it.
that's right.
Um,
That's
and
right.
uh, and it's, I feel like that about land too. This idea that once you start thinking that we have to make the most out of every acre of land, if it's going to make food, it's got to make as much food as possible, or else it's like should be storing more carbon. I think you kind of can't think of land the same way, and so they're very simple ideas, but they really are important. Like
Well,
my no beef diet is actually, again, it's not as good as going vegan. That's the best, and I
right.
always say you find the level of hypocrisy you're comfortable with, but it's about as good as going vegetarian, because vegetarians tend to eat more dairy, and again, like cattle are the problem now. Like cattle produce milk like several times a day, while they only produce beef like once in their life.
And that's
So
right.
that's why
That's
beef
right.
is so much worse. But again, I think once it's on your mind, if you're, it's something that people can make a difference. And I do think that this is one of those things where a lot of enviros are just like, no, it doesn't matter what you do with your personal carbon footprint. That's the corporations just trying to make you feel bad. And what we need to do is fix Exxon and fix JBS and fix Trump. But Trump isn't forcing us to eat all those burgers, and
Right.
and
Right.
neither is JBS. And so, I do think, this is Project Drawdown. They have their list of the top 100 things that could, opportunities for reducing emissions, and plant-based diets, depending on how they how they measure them, it's like either number one or number three. So it's a big deal.
So with that in mind, this leads to one of the more surprising elements about your book, which is that you seem to love big agriculture. You love big ag producers, manufacturers of food. And I'm exaggerating, but I'm not really exaggerating. I mean, you sort of make the argument that big ag, for all of its many faults, which you don't shy away from, they produce
Right.
food more efficiently. They use land better than smaller organic farmers do. And we should, in fact, in some ways, they are. I mean, if this is going too far, are they leading the way in some respects on how to get better on food production that's more efficient and better for the environment?
Well, right. You are exaggerating a little. I'm not super big fan of big ag. You saw I had over the weekend, I had an op-ed in the
Yes, you
Times
did.
about,
Yes, that's right.
about how, basically Democrats have to realize that they should stop shoveling money to rich Republican farmers who are never going to vote for them. Um, and I do, like you said, I do see the problems with industrial ag, the way they treat people, the way they treat animals, use too many antibiotics. Their
Right.
politics suck. Lots not to like about them. And what I would say is I love high yield ag, because if you can make more food per acre, you need fewer acres to make food. And right now we are on track to need another dozen California's worth of acres to feed the world by 2050, and we just don't have another dozen California's worth of acres to spare. Um, so yes, that does lead me towards some kind of uncomfortable truth that people don't like to hear, because factory farms, and even recognizing all their downsides, their upside is that factories are really good at make manufacturing a lot of affordable stuff.
Right.
And factory farms are good at making cheap food in large amounts. And I do write in the book about areas where, like, some regenerative ag is kind of the big alternative that people talk about these days. It's related to organic, but the idea is sort of using fewer chemicals, kind of treating the soil better. It's generally less intensive. But I do write that there are some regenerative practices. I went to ranches in Brazil where they're doing some stuff that Michael Pollan would hate, like they fertilize their pastures and they have feedlots. Ew, bad feedlots. Um, feedlot beef is actually way better for the environment than organic grass-fed beef.
Mm.
But they were doing some regenerative stuff. They had rotational grazing, which is sort of a more natural way of running cows. Sort of like they used to the ruminants, the buffalo on the plains. It's sort of mimicking that. They would let the cattle graze cover crops, which is and sort of poop on their crops so they don't have to put as much fertilizer on. And
Oh,
these are
wow.
like
Interesting.
these are things that Michael Pollan would really like, and they have kick-ass yields, so I'm all for it. But I do think that some of this regenerative movement, and you see it both on the left with Al Gore and Michael Pollan, but on the right with Joe Rogan and Bobby Kennedy. And you see it with the big environmental groups, but you
Mm.
also see it with some of these big agribusinesses, Archer Daniels Midland, the big food companies, General Mills. Everybody's pushing this kind of idea that kinder and gentler farming can sort of save the planet and reverse global warming. And if the yields aren't there, that's really bogus.
Yeah. So this is something I'll say it's like I love about the book and I love about just the way that you look at the world because uh, I sort of think it's very similar to how I look at the world and people that I like to read is that you sort of push back against the conventional wisdom, which just sounds a lot like your main character does this as well. That the assumption I think for most people is big ag is bad and big farms are bad and the kind of things that we sort of accept as kind of Kant especially on more on the left is actually more complicated than we realize. And for example, you talk a lot in the book about biofuels, which for years were considered, the great panacea, the best way to get us off climate change, and the whole, I guess, what's first third of the book is basically about Tim's effort to stop the support for biomass and for these kinds of things like ethanol, which he was basically
Yeah.
arguing are inefficient and bad for the environment.
Yeah, and they're horrible. I mean, it's just again, it's like, and it's a land use problem, right? And the fact that
Right,
everybody's saying it's great uh, doesn't mean it's great, and you end up sounding like some kind of climate denier when you're saying like everybody's wrong, right?
right, right, right.
Do your own research or something. But this is an area where the climate scientists who have been absolutely right about what carbon emissions are going to do to the planet,
Sure.
and the trajectory of our atmospheric carbon and temperatures. But they've been terrible on biofuels. And these are the scientists, and some of them have been captured in the same by some of the same agricultural interests. And I write about that in the book too. And it is. So yeah, there is a little bit of hanging a spoon on my high chair and saying like, I don't care what the consensus says. It's wrong. But you see it in like the big beautiful bill, which, as you mentioned, cuts like $1 trillion worth of clean energy subsidies. There's tens of billions of dollars of new subsidies for biofuels,
Hmm.
and not only that, because this stuff, they're particularly now want to put corn and soy into planes because electric vehicles have made it not work for there's no longer as much demand in our
Right.
cars. So they're calling it sustainable aviation fuel. But in the big, beautiful bill, there is language because what makes corn and soy so unsustainable as aviation fuel is land use. The language now says that when you're trying to figure out what's sustainable, you're not allowed to look at land use, which, oh, wow, when you're not allowed to see the big cost, looks like it has a lot of benefits.
Right.
Um,
I
but
mean,
uh, but this is a
I mean,
disaster. I mean, an acre of solar panels produces as much energy as 100 acres of corn grown for ethanol. So it's insane.
and the use of that land is inefficient, right? It's not producing the
Mm-hmm.
yield is not producing enough energy. You'd be better off using the land for some other purpose, right?
Right, but then the other exactly, and the main problem is that when you use land to grow fuel instead of food, you're going to have to replace the food somewhere else, and that somewhere else is not going to be a parking lot. It's going to be a forest or a wetland that
Right.
stores a lot of carbon and also absorbs the carbon that our fossil fuels are pumping into the atmosphere. So I always say that trying to decarbonize the planet while continuing to tear down trees is like trying to clean your house while smashing your vacuum cleaner to bits in the living room. It's like you're making a huge mess, but you're also crippling your ability to clean up the mess. And
Right.
that's what our
Right.
forests are. And so again, like, when I say we are eating the earth, that's what we're eating. Like we're
Right.
eating our carbon sinks, and we need them.
And those carbon things you talk, I mean, this is a big issue, obviously, deforestation. Um, it's weird to me this even this is a controversial issue, right? Cutting down, people usually like trees, right? It's one of, I mean, I remember as a kid, you'd see, um, don't stop forest fires, right? It was Smokey the Bear. Like he was like, the idea was like, we don't want to get rid of forests. Forests are good. But this has become
Right.
sort of a political issue. I mean, I know in Brazil when Bolsonaro was president, it was a major controversial issue. I mean, where are we? This seems like a very simple solution for dealing with climate change, which is more
Well,
forests mean more ways to soak up carbon.
Well, I think there's sort of two answers to that original question about why, why this is complicated. And the first is that remember, like, we're not doing much deforestation in the United States. And in fact, we're doing the opposite. Like in the
Right,
Northeast, you're seeing reforestation. And that's because we already did our deforestation in the 19th century, right?
right, right,
Like we
right.
already we already cut down our Amazon. Indiana was 85% forest.
Wow.
And so like the corn and soy farmers in Indiana, they think like, they're doing their part to feed the world. They're not like those bad farmers in Brazil who are cutting down trees, but it's like you're doing the same thing. And they just want to be like you. This is like the idea that there's difference between like recently deforested land and long ago deforested land. It's all deforested land, and it all has this carbon opportunity cost, which is what Tim Searchinger realized, that if you think about the potential of that land, there is a cost to using it even for agriculture. Now,
Right.
again, like biofuels are eating 1 Texas of the earth worth of the earth, and agriculture is eating 75 Texas's worth of the earth. So it's much bigger than just biofuels. But deforestation, and then the other thing is, livestock are eating 50
Right.
Texas's worth of the earth. And so when you say you want to stop deforestation, in a way you're saying we got to do something about meat and livestock, and that is touchy, right? Like
Yeah.
in America, meat is like guns, right? It's like it's
Right.
part of
Right.
our
Yeah.
culture.
Exactly.
And
Right.
I quoted a pollster who told me that like taxes or other restrictions on meat are the least popular policy of any kind that he's ever surveyed. He said it would be
Wow.
like veterans benefits for ISIS. Um, this isn't in the book. This is because we're doing politics. You'll like this story. This guy actually, and you're into polling. He used, when you pay people to do polls, you give people $10 to fill something out, and a lot of times the implication they pocket the $10 and then just check like yes, 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 yes,
Right.
yes.
Right.
So you have to have a control question to just make sure people are paying attention. So he used to use, should the government build statues for Nazis? Um, and but some people would look at that and say like, oh, this isn't a serious poll, and they just blow it
Right.
off. And then some people would actually get offended. So he changed it to, should there be taxes on meat?
Oh, wow.
It's like,
Oh,
the idea is
wow.
like that's another issue where it's like if you say yes on that, you probably weren't paying
And
attention.
you live in Florida, which is where the governor has banned the use of fake meat, basically, right?
Oh yeah, no, because we're of cultivated meat, right? The
Cultivated meat.
uh, the
Sorry.
meat made
Sorry.
from cells, because we're the free state of Florida.
Right.
So they're gonna tell us what fucking meat we can eat. Or
Right.
am I allowed to say that? It's like, I guess I can.
Don't worry about it. It's
It's
fine. It's fine.
Yeah. I mean, it's like it's crazy. And again, it's partly because he said like we stand with agriculture, we stand cattlemen,
Right.
and the
Right.
idea that someday this could be a threat to a Republican donor business. But really, I think it's more than that. It's this idea that because this is, meat that once it hits the market, and I've tasted it, it's like it's great. It's like it's meat because it's made of animal cells. I
Right.
mean, but just with 90% less land use and emissions. But because it is a kind of climate solution, right? It's woke meat,
It
right?
becomes
Just
woke
like
meat. Yeah, exactly.
electric vehicles were Obama mobiles, and now
Right.
these are like Biden burgers. And there's this idea that every issue has to get caught up in these political culture wars, where you have to, you can't solve problems. You just have to choose sides. I don't know. It sucks. It's annoying. I'm angry about it. Um,
let's be
Seven
clear.
seven states have banned cultivated meat before the shit even hits the market.
It's
Um,
unbelievable.
and it's,
But
yeah, it's
but I think
crazy.
one thing I did in your book is that this is not just, it's mostly a right wing phenomenon, not just a right wing phenomenon. And I
Oh
want
no,
to pick
yeah.
up on one thing that I really appreciate about your book. Okay. When I was in grad school, I got asked, I took this course on international economics. And I got asked to do a paper about defending the U.S. position on GMO foods, which is basically that the U.S. and the EU had a dispute because the U.S. sold agricultural products to the EU that contained genetically modified organisms, GMOs, and the EU wanted to label them as GMO, which would basically mean that no one would buy them. So the U.S. and the EU had a huge dispute over this. And I wrote this paper basically arguing that the U.S. position was correct, which I actually believed, because the arguments against GMOs were just based not based on science. They were based on sort of a misunderstanding. They were called frankenfoods. In fact, this and it led to this just wholesale rejection of GMOs. And in your book, you sort of point out that the criticisms of GMOs are, based largely on myth rather than reality, and that GMOs are actually a good product. They actually help us deal with climate change. So, talk a little bit about the issue of GMOs and why, like, genetically modified food is not has a long tradition in human history.
Yeah, I mean, right. So first I would say that like there's GMOs are like the most studied substances on the planet, and they are not bad for your health. They just aren't.
Right.
And they're not bad for the environment. They don't there's no science on that. It's just crap. So you start there. Now, actually, it's funny. Some of the GMO lovers have exaggerated their yield benefit. In some ways, they've been a little bit disappointing. Particularly in India, they've been very helpful. The GMOs that have kind of they sort of are engineered to have their own insecticides.
Right.
So particularly in places that don't have insecticides, that's been really helpful and has helped yields. And genetic modification of papayas saved papayas from extinction. Um, but mostly the opposition to them is just like it's just fear. I write about that Jimmy Kimmel did a segment where he went to an LA farmers market and
Right.
asked everybody about GMOs. Like, do you think GMOs are bad? Yes, horrible, terrible, evil. Do you know what GMOs are? No, no idea. It's just and like you said, it's not just on the right. It's not just Bobby Kennedy. It's also like everybody I go to yoga with. Um, and then for that matter, seed oils. Like there's nothing wrong with seed oils. There's just all these, people are afraid of things that aren't natural, I guess. You don't want technology in your food. But believe me, non-GMO corn that you can get today, organic corn, looks nothing like the corn that indigenous people grew in the Americas hundreds of years ago. It was bred. They were very sophisticated. They had their technologies and GMOs and ultimately gene editing, which is even more exciting and can really is a much more precise way of trying to make various crops not just higher yielding but drought tolerant and heat tolerant and flood
But also
tolerant
healthier,
and
right? I mean, you
yeah
talk
and
about, I think,
healthier
you talk
gluten
golden rice
gluten
in the book is
free.
something that can,
Right,
that,
golden rice, which will can cure or at least reduce vitamin A deficiencies in the
right.
developing world. They're just very exciting. Anything you want food to do, you can kind of edit it to do more of. You can make it healthier. You can make it higher yielding. You can make it tastier. And so this is very exciting. Like imagine tastier lentils, right? If
Yeah,
people
right,
ate more
right.
lentils, that would be really good. So again, it's hard to just say like people should know better. I don't know. People should read my book and then they should know better. It's just obviously it is very difficult going against this kind of cult of nature, where the idea that something is. I mean, like if you look at like they say that fake meat is unnatural or it's processed food, but
Right,
like
right, right.
what goes on inside a cow's stomach, that is a fucking process. Okay. It is like, it's really gross.
All
And,
four of them. They have four
and then,
studies, right?
yeah, exactly. And then what happens in these farms where, like, an industrial chicken of today, like, it's like, oh, I want real meat. Really? You want chicken that's been bred to grow to its full size in 6 weeks, and it's so breast heavy it can't even like stand up. It's just like, they're sitting in these barns where they're all pooping on each other and standing in it. It's just, this is not. People have these mythical ideas of what food is like, and yes, I have tried to do a little bit of myth busting, but there are trade-offs. All food is about trade-offs, and I guess all I can do is try to put out some facts, and then if people still want, I saw that there's somebody selling non-GMO salt. It's like, there is no such thing as
What the
GMO
hell is
salt.
non-GMO salt?
It is non-GMO, but it's like, it's not
But
that
that's
there's
like
GMO.
it's salt, isn't it?
It's salt, exactly. But
Like,
it's like, this
I
is
don't
just
understand.
this is just like, but it makes people feel virtuous, and
So that's
and
interesting.
so
So I
yeah.
have this weird thing where like when I go to, I'm probably one of the few people. Maybe you and I are the two people who do this. When I go to the supermarket, when I see organic versus non-organic, I immediately go to the non-organic, and not because it's cheaper, because I don't like the organic. The organic is not better. The organic, to me,
Well,
like we want cheaper food because that's actually good for the world. We have what 6 billion people in the world these days. Right? I wrote a book
yeah,
a
8
couple years
billion,
ago.
8 billion.
8 billion. Sorry, 8 billion. People are living longer lives. We have longer health, a longer life expectancy, which is great. We have less hunger in the world, but you need to feed all of these people, and you're going to keep getting. And as economic growth, it becomes sort of universal, and or more countries are doing well. You're going to have more people in the world. You're going to have more
Right.
because they're going to live
Right.
longer.
And
So
by the
how do
way,
you
the
feed
first
them?
thing, the first thing people do when they stop being poor is they start eating meat. And that's why we're on track to eat
Interesting.
70% more meat by 2050. So yeah, these things are hard, but the answer is, again, right. And like organic, your organic grass-fed beef, it eats more of the earth. And I'm not going to tell you
Is
not to eat it, but you should know that. And like, your carbon neutral milk is not carbon neutral. That's bogus. Your climate friendly, beer, it probably isn't either. And it's yeah. So I think that people are real. Like, again, I can say this because 7 years ago I was spectacularly ignorant about
right,
about this
right,
stuff.
right.
But I think that most people are, and even on nutrition. Look, I do. Like, I do feel like on the environmental stuff, I really do know what I'm talking about. On the nutrition, I kind of know just enough to be dangerous. But I will say this: like, what matters is what you eat, and then for the climate, to some extent, how it's grown. But from a nutritional perspective, it's like it doesn't matter if your food was grown with pesticides. Like, don't drink the pesticides. Don't bathe in the pesticides.
I
But how it's
yes,
grown, it just like doesn't matter. And yet people are trying to ban pesticides. They did it in Sri Lanka. Within 6 months, they had an agricultural catastrophe. Their yields crashed. They had food shortages, food
Mm,
riots, and the government fell. This is like,
really,
pesticides are pretty good at killing pests. Fertilizer
right,
is pretty good at helping stuff grow. And the
right.
people were just kind of like, we don't like it. It's chemical. It's not natural. It's like, well, let's come. And I do write about, biological alternatives to where you're gene editing microbes to fetch nitrogen from the air and feed it to the crops, or biological pesticides where they use the mRNA technology behind the COVID vaccines to literally constipate beetles to death. That's great. Like, if we can do things that are going to help us make more food with less mess, that's where we should be investing, and that's what we should be supporting. But this idea, just like, oh, we like, farms should look like this because that's what they were like when I was a kid, and who cares? We don't really need more food. We just need to distribute it better. It's like, well, until you figure out how to distribute it
Yeah,
better, like, then
you need more
who are
food.
you going to starve, and
Yeah,
who are
yeah.
you going to, like, which forests are you going to cut down? I just think there's this very, like, people don't want to grapple with these issues, and like, like you can hate me, but I grappled. That's
So
the
that's the thing. I think one thing about the book that I really appreciate was that, and I'm sort of you're preaching to the choir with me when it comes to stuff like organic food, but I think that it sort of forces people to it challenges your assumptions about food, and it challenges your assumptions about the environment, about agriculture. And I am always struck by when I go on one of my sort of like pro GMO rants that people always sort of step back and they say, I don't like pesticides in my food, and I don't like um, these big factories, and I want my the cattle that I eat to be have like a good lives and to eat grass and so forth. And I just think that it's demystifying in a way that is exceptionally helpful. And I hope that people who obviously are going to watch this, or people who are, who follow me or tend to be more left of center, I hope that you take away from this that there's a lot that all of us can do. It's not just a question of saying, well, we need better laws in Washington. I mean, we do, but there's things that we can do. And I want to finish up with that point. You talked a little earlier about things we can do. And I took away from your presentation a couple weeks ago that I should just eat less lamb and less beef, and I'm doing that. But beyond that, what else do you think that we can do on a personal level to be, I don't know, better guardians of the environment? But when it comes to, at least in the context of food.
What's funny, I got asked the other day, like, what are the three things? And I said, first, eat less beef,
Yeah,
and for the reasons we've talked about. And second, waste less food, because we waste about a quarter of our food. And that means we waste all the farmland and fertilizer and water
right.
that's used to grow that food. So we're now using a landmass the size of China to grow garbage. And it's in your, the average American
Mm,
household wastes like $1,500 a year on food that never makes it to their stomachs. So that's a significant one. But those two are so much more significant than the other kind of minor changes that you can make in your diet.
mm.
But I told the president, and then I guess number three would be eat even less beef. And then,
Really?
and because it really is, that's the baddie, I guess. And then obviously politics matters, on all of these issues. And it is true. A lot of my book is, I guess, some people are calling it hippie bashing or hippie punching or whatever that I do punch left some in this book, although it has become a kind of horseshoe thing on some of these like all natural
Yeah,
food stuff,
right.
where RFK Jr. is just as it's in many ways even worse than the people in my yoga class. But I do think that's an important idea. Um, that basically, if you have Democrats, you at least have a chance of climate policy.
Right.
And the Democrats, like I think obviously I think it's important for there to be debates about this stuff within the Democratic Party, but to the extent we're talking about doing things that are good for the climate and good for the planet, we're basically only talking about Democrats,
Yeah,
because
yeah, that's
Republicans
exactly right.
Republicans have stepped out of this conversation. So although
Well, it's not
I'm
that
gonna
they
do
stepped out. I mean,
Steve
it,
Bannon's show. So
oh,
we'll see if
that's well,
you know
I'm curious to see how that goes. I mean, but I think it's more they stepped out of it. They are actively hostile to anything that is considered good for the environment, and for largely cultural and political reasons. I mean, I think it's really tragic. It's become eating healthy. That's not even what I want to say. That thinking about the environment become this incredibly partisan issue on every level. Driving an electric vehicle, which is more efficient, it's better for the economy. You can get a huge tax credit, or you still get a huge tax credit. All of that has become so partisanized that it's people on the right don't want to have a conversation about it, even though these are all
it's
things that make our lives better.
I did a piece. This was back when I was as obsessed with politics and focused on politics as you are. And this is when I was at Politico magazine, and I did back when there was still a magazine, in fact, an actual glossy magazine, and I had a cover story about how everything became the culture war.
Right.
And the
I
lead
actually
of that
remember
story
that piece. Actually,
and
remember that piece.
the lead of that story was John McCain making a speech in Pennsylvania during his when he ran for president, and he said for the first time, drill, baby, drill. And there was like this, it was like he had set off a bomb in the stadium. It was like there was this frisson of excitement where it was sort of like, and you could almost, it was like the people in the room, they were like for, it was like they were drilling the liberals.
Right.
It
Right.
wasn't, and it wasn't about like, they've, well, if you look at our analysis of the oil industry and the supply
Right.
side,
Right.
it's not, it had nothing to do with that. It was just this visceral, this idea that you were owning the libs, but by drilling and by screw you with your pansy climate policy,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That's really what it was about. And I think, and I will, pat myself on the back. And I did in that piece, which I think was 2017 or maybe 2018. I saw that the next issue like that was going to be education.
Yes, I
That that
remember
was
having a
going
conversation with you. I remember having a conversation
that
with
was
you.
that was going to
Absolutely.
be the next thing. I remember, watching. I followed some of these Republicans running for Senate in Ohio, telling these like bogus stories about meeting drug addicts who said like, I wish I hadn't gotten a liberal education,
Right.
and it
Right.
was like, and it was just like you could just see it was like those people go to college, and it was
Yeah.
the same exact thing. And I do think to the extent I sort of despair for the country, aside from the current leadership. But if you could move past that, what's going to make it hard is this idea that we are so into our, that it has become so shirts and skins, not
Yeah.
just in a competitive way, but in a way where like the facts really don't matter, the policy doesn't matter. It's all, everything is just, there's no information, there's only ammunition. And that it's really like literal ammunition that you can use these issues to shoot at the other guy.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
it's just impossible to solve problems that way.
Yeah. I listen, I totally agree with you. And I remember this conversation we had. I visited you in Miami and I think it was actually 2018. And you talk about education as being the next cultural war issue. And of course, you see this with the attacks
Yeah.
on higher education now. That's what's happened. I think it is, you know, everything has become a cultural war issue. Everything's become a divisive issue. And it's not good for the future of the country, not good for solving problems. But I'm going to add one last thing that you can do to help the environment, and that is that you can purchase We Are Eating the
Ah,
Earth. That's what you can do. You can purchase Mike's book. You can give it to your friends. You can give them the advice that he gives in the book. You can give them a little dose of optimism that he provides in the book. It's a great read. We've known each other for a very long time. We met. I remember to this day, I'll never forget 2012 Republican National Convention. We were standing near each other during the Mitt
Clint
Romney
Eastwood.
uh,
Clint Eastwood.
I'm sorry, excuse me, sorry, Clint Eastwood talking to the chair. And I remember, I
That's
can
right.
to this day remember, I saw you at the airport the day after, and I want to talk to you about everything. And you're like, you only wanted to talk about the chair. That's all you wanted to talk about. And that was kind of the defining issue of that
Like
convention.
surprising things don't, like truly surprising things don't happen that often in politics.
It's true.
That was surprising.
That was surprising. And if you're talking about, go back and you can watch it. It was the 10 o'clock on Thursday night, the last night of the RNC, and Clint Eastwood came out, and I'm not exaggerating. He talked to a chair for about 5 minutes, and it was the most uncomfortable and embarrassing thing I've ever seen. And by the way, I also think, by the way, it's the one that made Twitter. Twitter was still in its infancy around this time, and
Interesting.
literally every political journalist was just like, can you effing believe he is talking to a chair? And that became the dominant narrative about that evening. Of
That's
course, because
interesting.
after Eastwood spoke, Romney gave his acceptance address, but all the reporter talked about was the chair. Anyway,
That's
so
amazing. Somebody
yeah,
should
it
write a
was.
dissertation about that. That's
I know, right?
that is that's yeah.
For me at least, as somebody who covered politics, like I remember that being the moment when Twitter kind of like it it defined the narrative. Let's put it this way: that because every political journalist was talking about the chair, it became the defining narrative, and it was how that communication tool became the way that journalists sort of interpreted the political news. That's how I saw it, at least. And I think we still have that to some extent now. And
I'll allow
I,
it.
yeah, I think it was a fairly crucial moment. Also, quite funny. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. But listen, Michael, thank you so much for being here, and for all my listeners, please pick up this book. It's great. It's really important read, and Michael does incredibly important work, incredibly important reporting, and he's one of the best that are out there. And I mean that very sincerely. I'm not just saying it.
Oh, thanks.
He's a great political reporter, and a great writer, and a great thinker, and someone I think you should all be following and reading his books. Thanks for being here, Michael. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. And thanks for those kind words. I really do appreciate it. You're awesome.
Yeah, thank you. All right.